There are people in history who lose everything because of one mistake. And then there are people who get everything they wanted, only to discover it cost them their peace. This is one of those stories, because sometimes winning does not feel like victory. Sometimes getting what you wanted becomes the beginning of everything falling apart. His name was Jacob, a man remembered as chosen, blessed, favored, the father of nations, one of the most important figures in biblical history. And yet, his story begins somewhere deeply uncomfortable, with deception, manipulation, and betrayal. Because according to the ancient story, Jacob stole something that was never fully his, a blessing. His brother's blessing, the future, the inheritance, the identity of the firstborn. And strangely, he succeeded. Think about that for a moment. The plan worked. The lie succeeded. The father was deceived. The blessing was spoken. The future changed. Jacob won. At least, that is how it looked. But perhaps that is where the tragedy truly begins. Because what happens after you finally get what you wanted and realize something inside still feels broken? What happens when success tastes strangely bitter? What happens when victory costs trust, family, home, peace? Because Jacob did not walk away celebrating. He ran, afraid, alone, haunted. The moment Esau discovered what happened, everything changed. Imagine the scene. A father old and blind. A brother realizing he has been betrayed. The weight of deception finally exposed. The room suddenly heavy with anger, shock, regret, and then rage. The Bible describes Esau crying out, not quietly, not calmly, a cry filled with heartbreak, a cry many people still feel thousands of years later, because betrayal hurts differently. When it comes from family, especially a brother, especially someone who already knew your weaknesses. And perhaps Jacob heard something terrifying in Esau's silence afterward. Not grief, danger. Because Esau wanted revenge. And honestly, who could blame him? Everything felt stolen. The birthright gone, the blessing gone, the future gone. And suddenly, Jacob understood something painful. Winning sometimes creates enemies. Even justified dreams can become poisoned when reached through deception. And perhaps that is what makes Jacob's story so haunting, because many people understand what it feels like to carry guilt, not dramatic guilt, quiet guilt. The kind that follows people silently. The kind that appears late at night. The kind whispering. Was it worth it? Because maybe Jacob got the blessing, but lost something else. Peace, trust, belonging, home. Imagine leaving everything behind overnight. No celebration, no feeling of triumph. Only fear. Fear of what comes next. Fear of consequences finally arriving. Fear that someone you hurt might eventually find you. And perhaps that feeling feels painfully modern, because many people understand what it means to run. Not always physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. Running from regret, running from shame, running from painful choices, running from parts of ourselves we do not want to face. And maybe that is why Jacob still matters, because deep down, many people quietly wonder, can someone who hurt people truly change? Can guilt ever become healing? Can a broken person become someone new? Because Jacob was not simple. He was clever, manipulative, complicated, wounded, chosen, yet deeply flawed. And, perhaps, that contradiction makes him feel deeply human, because real people are rarely only good. or only bad. People hurt others. People justify mistakes. People carry wounds from childhood. People repeat unhealthy patterns. People become the very thing they once feared. And perhaps Jacob learned manipulation somewhere. After all, he grew up inside a divided family. A mother favoring one son, a father favoring another. Competition everywhere. Love never fully equal. And maybe that shaped him more than anyone realized, because children raised inside dysfunction often learn survival instead of trust, strategy instead of honesty, control instead of vulnerability. And perhaps Jacob became exactly that, a survivor, a strategist, a man who learned early, if life does not give you blessing, take it. But perhaps he never imagined what taking it would cost, because sometimes the thing people chase hardest becomes the thing that quietly destroys their peace. And strangely, Jacob's real story does not begin when he steals the blessing. It begins after the lie, after the betrayal, after consequences begin. Because from that moment forward, Jacob becomes something many people recognize. A man running from family, running from fear, running from consequences, and perhaps running from himself. Yet somewhere along the road, something unexpected begins happening. The manipulator begins suffering. The deceiver becomes deceived. The runaway begins changing. And one night, alone, afraid, broken, Jacob would face something so mysterious. People still argue about it thousands of years later. A fight, a wound, a struggle in darkness, a moment where one man allegedly wrestled with God. And somehow, nothing about him remained the same afterward. But before we get there, before we ask whether Jacob truly changed, before we decide whether redemption is possible, we must go back to the family that shaped him, back to the rivalry that raised him, back to the home where love quietly became competition. Because perhaps Jacob's story did not begin with stealing. Perhaps it began much earlier, inside a family where everyone learned something dangerous. Love had to be earned. Before we can understand Jacob, before we can understand the lie, the stolen blessing, the guilt, the running, we must first understand the family that shaped him. Because people rarely become complicated in isolation. Human beings are formed somewhere, inside homes, inside silence, inside love, inside wounds. And perhaps that is especially true for Jacob, because Jacob was born into a family carrying more emotional weight than most people realize. A family blessed, yet fractured, faithful, yet divided, chosen, yet deeply human. To understand Jacob, we must go back to Isaac and Rebekah, the son of Abraham, the miracle child who almost died on a mountain, and the woman who crossed into his life carrying hope. At first, their story looked beautiful. Hope after waiting, love after loneliness, a family finally beginning. But sometimes, beautiful beginnings quietly carry unresolved pain. And perhaps Isaac himself still carried emotional complexity. Imagine growing up as the son almost sacrificed, the child of impossible expectations, the center of enormous spiritual pressure, the son Abraham nearly lost, trauma, maybe, fear, possibly, silence, almost certainly. The Bible says little about Isaac emotionally, yet silence itself often tells stories, and perhaps people carrying unresolved wounds sometimes parent imperfectly, not because they lack love, but because pain quietly shapes behavior. Then came the twins, Jacob and Esau, and already their story began with tension. The biblical text says they struggled even before birth. conflict before language, competition before memory, and according to the story, a strange prophecy surrounded them. The older will serve the younger. Pause there, because expectations entered the family early. Comparison entered early. Division entered early. Even before either boy fully understood life, the family already carried invisible tension. Esau came first, strong, hairy, wild, a hunter, the kind of son ancient cultures admired, masculine, independent, capable, the son fathers often understood instinctively. Jacob, very different, quiet, reflective, closer to home. The Bible says he dwelled among tents, not weaker, simply different. But difference inside families often becomes comparison, especially when parents fail to notice what they are creating. And here, the story turns painfully human, because the text says something many families still struggle with today. Isaac loved Esau. Rebekah loved Jacob. Read that slowly. Not shared affection. Not equal attachment. Divided love. A house quietly split in half. Imagine growing up there. Imagine family dinners, conversations, small moments, subtle favoritism, the feeling children always notice, even when adults think they hide it. Esau feeling his father's approval, Jacob sensing his mother's protection, two brothers growing side by side, yet learning different emotional lessons. Modern psychology understands this deeply. Children raised in unequal emotional environments adapt. The favored child often grows confident, yet pressured. The overlooked child often becomes strategic, hyper-aware, sensitive to fairness. And perhaps that explains more than people realize about Jacob, because Jacob grew up second, not firstborn, not naturally favored by Isaac, not physically admired like Esau. He likely understood something early. Direct competition would never work. He could not out-hunt Esau, could not outstrength Esau, could not become who Esau already was. So perhaps he learned another strategy: thinking, waiting, manipulating, adapting. And maybe that sounds harsh, but honestly, many children learn survival patterns inside family systems. Some become peacemakers. Some become achievers. Some become rebels. Some become manipulators. Not because they are evil, because adaptation feels necessary. Children quietly ask, how do I stay safe here? How do I matter here? How do I get love here? And maybe Jacob learned something dangerous. Blessings are not given. Blessings must be secured. Because when love feels unequal, security becomes fragile, and fragile people often try controlling outcomes. Still, Esau carried burdens too. People often simplify him, the strong brother, the impulsive one. But strong children sometimes struggle emotionally too. Imagine growing up loved for performance, for strength, for masculinity, for hunting, for competence. What happens when vulnerability feels unsafe? What happens when emotional needs go unseen? Perhaps Esau learned something dangerous too. I am valued for what I do, not who I am. And suddenly, both brothers begin making more sense. One compensates through strategy, the other through instinct. One learns manipulation, the other impulsiveness. And quietly, family dysfunction begins writing future tragedy. Then came the birthright, the infamous bowl of stew. Esau hungry, Jacob opportunistic, a decision made in exhaustion. And perhaps the family system quietly shaped that moment too, because emotional hunger matters. People undervalue things when emotional needs feel unmet. People make impulsive decisions when depleted. And perhaps Jacob already knew how to leverage weakness. After all, he had spent years living in comparison, years observing, years learning how power moved inside family. Still, the deeper betrayal came later. The blessing. Shizek old, blind, near death. A sacred family moment. The blessing of inheritance. Identity. Leadership. Future. Naturally, Esau expected it. Why would not he? He was firstborn. Shizek clearly favored him. Everything pointed towards certainty. Except Rebekah intervened. Pause there, because this part matters deeply. Jacob did not act alone. His mother helped, planned, directed, strategized. Imagine that dynamic. A mother choosing one child over another, protecting one child's future, while sacrificing another's trust. Modern families understand this too. Sometimes parents quietly create division without realizing consequences. Triangulation, favoritism, emotional alliances, parents pulling children into conflicts, children becoming extensions of unresolved family tension. And perhaps that happened here. Rebekah believed Jacob deserved the blessing. Maybe she remembered the prophecy. Maybe favoritism blinded her. Maybe fear pushed her. Whatever the reason, the result became devastating. Jacob disguised himself, wore Esau's clothing, covered his skin, imitated his brother, and deceived his father. Imagine the emotional complexity there. A son pretending to be someone else, just to receive love and blessing. That feels symbolic somehow, because perhaps many people know what it feels like to become someone else for approval. Pretending, performing, adapting, shaping identity around survival. And perhaps Jacob's deception began long before the lie itself. Maybe it began the moment he believed, "Who I naturally am may not be enough." That feels deeply human, because many people still carry that fear. And when the blessing finally came, everything changed. Jacob succeeded, Esau devastated, Shizek shocked, Rebekah divided from her family, trust broken, and suddenly the entire house collapsed emotionally, because deception inside families rarely ends quietly. It lingers, years, sometimes generations. And perhaps that is the deeper historical background of Jacob. Not merely a man who lied, but a man shaped inside a system already breaking. A family where favoritism replaced unity, comparison replaced trust, manipulation replaced honesty, and children quietly learned dangerous lessons. Perhaps Esau learned it. Strength matters most. Perhaps Jacob learned control outcomes before someone takes from you. Neither lesson healthy, both deeply human, and honestly, that feels painfully modern. Because many people still grow up inside emotional systems shaping adulthood quietly. Family wounds, competition, conditional love, pressure, silence. And years later, people still carry invisible lessons learned in childhood, sometimes without realizing it. And maybe that is why Jacob's story still matters. Because before he became a liar, he was a child. Before he became a deceiver, he was adapting. Before he stole a blessing, he lived inside a family already teaching him something dangerous. Love felt uncertain. And when love feels uncertain, people often do desperate things to feel secure. Still, the real tragedy had only begun. Because after the blessing, consequences arrived. Fear arrived. Separation arrived. And one man, who finally got everything he wanted, would discover something painfully ironic. Sometimes, getting the blessing is exactly when peace disappears. There are moments in life when people leave home, but somehow, home never really leaves them. The voices remain, the guilt remains, the memories remain. And no matter how far people run, something painful quietly follows. Perhaps that is where Jacob's real story begins. Not with the blessing, not with deception, but after the lie worked, after the future changed, after silence inside the family turned dangerous. Because sometimes getting what you wanted becomes the beginning of fear. Imagine the house after everything happened. Shizak devastated, blind, confused, realizing the son he blessed was not the son he intended. Esau shattered, angry, humiliated, the future slipping through his hands, a blessing gone forever. And Jacob finally holding what he wanted. Yet strangely, nothing about victory felt peaceful, because betrayal leaves consequences, even successful betrayal. The ancient story says Esau's grief turned toward anger, deep anger, the kind that simmers quietly, the kind born from humiliation, loss, broken trust, and perhaps one sentence terrified Jacob more than anything. Esau planned to kill him. Pause there, because suddenly everything changed. The blessing remained, but safety disappeared. Home disappeared. Family disappeared. And perhaps that is the painful irony of Jacob's story. He gained the future, but lost peace. Imagine the fear, sleeping no longer feeling safe, every sound suspicious, every moment tense. The brother you grew up beside, now dangerous. The home that shaped you, suddenly unsafe. And then another familiar pattern emerged. Rebekah intervened. Again, she urged Jacob to leave. Run, escape, go far away, stay with relatives, survive. Imagine the goodbye, or perhaps the absence of one. The Bible never gives us a dramatic farewell. No reconciliation, no healing, no long conversation between brothers, just departure. And perhaps that silence feels heartbreaking, because sometimes families break quietly, without closure, without resolution, only distance. Jacob left, alone. The manipulator became a fugitive. The chosen son became displaced. And perhaps, for the first time in his life, there was nowhere left to hide. No mother protecting him. No familiar home. No carefully controlled environment. Only wilderness. Only uncertainty. Only himself. Imagine that first night. Darkness stretching endlessly. No walls. No comfort. No family. No certainty. Just one man, lying beneath the open sky, a stone beneath his head, fear inside his chest, perhaps guilt too. And somewhere, the terrifying question, was any of this worth it? Because maybe, for the first time, Jacob sat alone with consequences. No distractions, no strategy, only silence. And strangely, something extraordinary happened. The ancient story says Jacob dreamed a ladder, or perhaps stairs, stretching between heaven and earth, angels ascending, descending, movement between worlds, and somehow, inside fear, came a promise, protection, future, meaning. Imagine waking after that dream, alone, yet somehow changed. The text says Jacob looked around and realized, surely God was here. And perhaps that moment matters deeply, because maybe transformation often begins when people hit emotional bottom, when life strips away control, when certainty disappears, when consequences finally arrive. Still, Jacob kept running, far from home, far from Esau, toward relatives he barely knew. And there, life began teaching him something painful. The deceiver would soon experience deception himself, because perhaps life has strange ways of revealing character. Jacob arrived, met Rachel, and according to the story, something unusual happened. Love. Real love. The text says Jacob loved Rachel deeply, worked years to marry her. Imagine that. After guilt, fear, loneliness, hope again, meaning again, a future again. The years passed. Hard work, patience, dreaming of marriage. And then the wedding night came, except morning brought something shocking. The deceiver had been deceived. Instead of Rachel, Leah, her older sister. Pause there, because perhaps, for the first time, Jacob understood betrayal differently. The confusion, the helplessness, the feeling of reality shifting overnight. The ancient story almost feels poetic. A man who deceived his blind father, now deceived in darkness himself. And perhaps life quietly whispered, "Do you understand now?" Still, Jacob continued. More years, more struggle, more family complexity, more competition. And somehow, history repeated itself, because the family Jacob built became complicated too. Jealousy, favoritism, competition between wives, children growing inside emotional tension. And perhaps this matters more than people realize, because unresolved pain often repeats itself. People recreate what shaped them, not intentionally, but unconsciously. Jacob grew up inside division, and somehow division followed him, because wounds unhealed often become patterns repeated. Still, years passed. Jacob became wealthy, built life, created family, yet peace, still uncertain, because eventually something terrifying happened. The past returned. Word arrived. Esau was coming, after years apart, and he was not alone. Hundreds of men traveled with him. Imagine Jacob hearing that, fear returning instantly, the old guilt rising, the old wound reopening. Perhaps this is how unresolved pain works. You can outrun consequences temporarily, but eventually, something returns. A memory, a person, a truth, and suddenly you realize Jacob panicked, prepared gifts, made plans, divided camps, tried controlling outcomes, just like always, because old habits stay stubborn, even after years. But then came the night everything changed. Alone, darkness, silence, no family nearby, no distractions, only Jacob. And suddenly, someone appeared. The Bible describes something mysterious. A man and angel, God himself. No one fully agrees. Only this, they wrestled through the night. Imagine that scene. Exhausted, afraid, carrying decades of guilt, fear, manipulation, running, and suddenly struggling physically, while perhaps struggling spiritually too. Because maybe this was never just a fight. Maybe Jacob was finally wrestling with himself. The liar, the survivor, the manipulator, the frightened child still desperate for blessing. And perhaps that feels deeply human, because everyone eventually wrestles something: regret, identity, pain, fear, the self they became, the self they want to become. The struggle lasted until dawn. Then, something strange happened. Jacob was wounded. His hip struck. Weakness entered. And perhaps that matters, because transformation often wounds pride, breaks control. Humility enters painfully. Still, Jacob refused to let go. The text says, he declared, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Pause there, because, perhaps, that sentence reveals everything, all his life. Jacob chased blessing, stole blessing, manipulated blessing, controlled outcomes. Yet now, something changed. He no longer demanded blessing through deception. He asked honestly. And then, the most important moment arrived. A question. "What is your name?" Jacob answered. Jacob, the deceiver, the heel grabber, the manipulator, the survivor. And perhaps, for the first time, he stopped hiding. Then came transformation. A new name. Israel. One who wrestles. One transformed through struggle. Imagine the sunrise. Jacob limping, wounded, changed. Still imperfect. Still human. Yet somehow different. Because maybe real transformation does not erase scars. Perhaps it changes how people carry them. And the next morning, Jacob finally faced Esau, the brother he feared, the brother he hurt, expecting revenge, expecting punishment. Yet something unexpected happened. Esau ran toward him and embraced him. After everything, grace. And perhaps that moment feels almost unbelievable, because maybe the thing Jacob feared most had already softened. Or perhaps both brothers finally understood something painful. Life had wounded them both, and maybe that is Jacob's journey in the end. Not merely a man running from family, but a man running from himself, until life finally forced him to stop. And perhaps that is why his story still matters. Because many people know what it feels like to carry guilt, to outrun consequences, to hide from parts of themselves, until one day, life quietly whispers, "You cannot keep running forever." Because maybe real change only begins when people finally stop running long enough to wrestle honestly with who they have become. And now, we arrive at one of the strangest, most mysterious, and most debated moments in the entire Bible. A story so unusual that even believers struggle to explain it. A man alone at night, fear rising, darkness surrounding him. And suddenly, a struggle, a fight, hours of wrestling, until dawn. And somehow, history remembers it this way. Jacob wrestled with God. Pause there, because honestly, that sentence sounds impossible. What does it even mean? Did Jacob literally fight God? Physically, face to face? Was it symbolic? A dream, a spiritual encounter, and angel, a psychological breakdown. Something humanity still does not fully understand. Because for thousands of years, people have argued about this moment. And perhaps the deeper people study it, the stranger it becomes. Let us begin with the story itself. Jacob had spent years running from Esau, running from consequences, building life far from home. Yet eventually, the past returned. Esau was coming, 400 men beside him, and suddenly, Jacob felt terror again. Imagine the fear? Years earlier, you betrayed someone deeply. Now they return, powerful, prepared. Unknown intentions. Anyone would panic. The text says Jacob divided his family, prepared gifts, made plans, tried controlling outcomes, because fear often makes people strategize. Still, one night, Jacob found himself alone, completely alone. That detail matters, Because transformation often begins in isolation, when distractions disappear, when performance disappears, when people can no longer avoid themselves. And then, without warning, the story becomes mysterious. Genesis says, "A man wrestled with him until daybreak." That is all. No dramatic introduction, no clear explanation, only mystery. A man, darkness, struggle, and perhaps that ambiguity matters, because uncertainty invites interpretation. Who was this figure? Some readers say, God himself. Others argue, an angel. Some point to another biblical passage describing the encounter as wrestling with an angel. Others see symbolism, psychological struggle, internal conflict, externalized. And honestly, every interpretation raises fascinating questions. Let us explore them. Theory 1. Jacob literally wrestled with God. This is the traditional reading. Many believers throughout history accepted the story at face value. Something supernatural happened. A divine encounter. Real, mysterious, physical, sacred. After all, Jacob later said, he saw God face to face. He named the place Peniel, meaning roughly, the face of God. And perhaps this interpretation emphasizes something beautiful. God meeting humanity inside struggle, not inside comfort, not inside certainty, but inside fear, pain, honest wrestling. Still, questions remain. Because how does a human being physically wrestle God? Would not God overpower Jacob instantly? Why struggle all night? Why allow resistance? And perhaps those questions pushed many readers toward other interpretations. Theory 2. Jacob wrestled an angel. This theory gained support from another biblical text. The prophet Hosea later describes Jacob wrestling and refers to an angelic figure. For many scholars, this resolves some tension. Not God, literally, but a divine messenger, a supernatural being representing divine confrontation. This interpretation feels easier for many people, still mysterious, still sacred, yet slightly more understandable. Yet even here, questions remain. Why does Jacob describe seeing God? Why the new name? Why the life-changing transformation? Clearly, something enormous happened psychologically or spiritually, even if the figure was not literally God himself. Theory 3. The story is symbolic. Now, this theory becomes deeply fascinating. Some scholars argue, perhaps the entire wrestling match symbolizes inner struggle. Think about Jacob's life for a moment. Manipulation, guilt, fear, running, broken family relationships, years of consequences. Now, the brother he betrayed approaches. The past finally catches up. And suddenly, Jacob spends a night wrestling. Could this represent psychological struggle? Shame battling identity, fear battling hope, the old self confronting the possibility of change. Honestly, that interpretation feels surprisingly powerful, because humans often describe emotional struggle physically. People say, he wrestled with guilt. He battled fear. Perhaps Jacob's story externalizes something deeply internal. A man finally confronting himself. The liar, the manipulator, the frightened child still desperate for blessing. And perhaps that makes the story profoundly human, because everyone eventually wrestles something. Identity, regret, fear, pain, shame, And maybe Jacob's struggle simply gave visible form to invisible reality. Still, there is another theory. Theory 4. A trauma-induced spiritual experience. Modern psychology introduces something fascinating. Extreme emotional stress changes perception. Think about Jacob's state. Fear, sleep deprivation, isolation, anticipation of danger, emotional overload. Psychologists know humans under severe stress sometimes experience vivid spiritual or symbolic encounters, dreamlike states, profound inner experiences, moments feeling more real than reality itself. Could Jacob's wrestling experience reflect something psychologically authentic, even if not physically literal? Perhaps. And honestly, that possibility does not necessarily make the story less meaningful, because psychological experiences can transform lives profoundly. Sometimes, the deepest battles happen internally, and internal battles often feel more real than physical. As we walk through this sacred month of March. Still, there is something historians notice too. Ancient stories often used physical struggle as symbolic language. Kings wrestling gods, heroes battling divine beings, transformation arriving through confrontation. The wrestling motif appears across cultures, but Jacob's story feels different somehow. More vulnerable, more personal. No triumph, no conquest. Jacob leaves wounded, limping, changed. That detail matters, because real transformation often wounds pride, leaves scars, costs something. And perhaps that feels psychologically true regardless of interpretation, because genuine change hurts, healing hurts, growth hurts, honesty hurts. People rarely become new without something old breaking first. Still, let me say something personal. Not certainty, only perspective. If you ask me, did Jacob literally wrestle God? He thinks something profoundly real happened, whether physical, spiritual, psychological, somehow all at once. He cannot say with certainty. But I think Jacob encountered something undeniable, something transformative, because people do not leave experiences like that unchanged. And Jacob changed. The text makes that clear. Before the night, he controlled, manipulated, ran. Afterward, he limped, faced Esau, stopped hiding. Something shifted. And perhaps that matters more than proving mechanics. Because maybe the deeper truth of the story was never physics. Perhaps the deeper truth was transformation. A broken man finally confronting himself honestly, a survivor surrendering control, a manipulator learning vulnerability. And perhaps that feels painfully relevant today, because many people spend years running from mistakes, from guilt, from grief, from fear, from themselves, until eventually, life forces confrontation, a breakup, loss, burnout, illness, failure, loneliness. Some moment arrives saying, you cannot outrun this anymore. And suddenly, people wrestle with identity, with pain, with meaning, with God, with themselves. And perhaps that is why Jacob still matters, because whether literal or symbolic, the wrestling feels universal. Human beings do not transform through comfort. They transform through struggle, through nights no one sees, through fears no one understands, through painful honesty. And maybe that is Jacob's deepest mystery, not whether he wrestled God, but whether every human being eventually must wrestle something bigger than themselves, because perhaps transformation only begins when running finally ends And maybe the question Jacob still leaves humanity with is this: what are you still running from, that life is quietly asking you to finally face? Because sometimes the most important fight of a lifetime happens in darkness, where nobody else can see it. Now, let us step away from Jacob for a moment. Forget the tents, forget the desert, forget ancient family rivalries, and ask a question that feels painfully modern. Can people ever truly escape the consequences of their choices? Because if we are honest, that question follows almost everyone. Maybe not dramatically, maybe not with brothers chasing us through wilderness, but quietly, in late-night thoughts, private regret, unfinished conversations, mistakes no one else fully understands. Because perhaps that is why Jacob still matters. Not because most people stole blessings, not because most people ran from angry brothers, but because many people know what it feels like to live with consequences. The uncomfortable truth that choices stay alive longer than emotions. And honestly, modern culture often teaches the opposite. People hear phrases like, just move on, forget the past, reinvent yourself. And sometimes, that advice sounds comforting. Except life rarely works that way. Because consequences have strange persistence. The past rarely disappears simply because people stop talking about it. Jacob understood that. He ran far, built a new life, worked hard, fell in love, started a family, became successful. Years passed, yet somehow, the past remained unfinished. His saw still existed, the betrayal still existed, the guilt still existed, and one day, everything returned. Because perhaps the most painful truth about consequences is this: time delays many consequences. It does not erase them. And maybe many people listening understand that feeling. The relationship neglected years ago, the friendship broken in pride, health ignored for decades, a lie told long ago, unresolved guilt, avoided grief, emotional wounds pushed aside. At first, life moves on. Everything seems fine. But eventually, something returns. A memory, a consequence, a truth. And suddenly, people realize he never really dealt with this. And perhaps that is where Jacob feels deeply modern. Because many people spend years running, not physically, emotionally, running through distraction, work, relationships, busyness, success, achievement, anything avoiding discomfort, anything preventing stillness, because stillness makes old truths louder. And perhaps that is why modern life stays noisy. People fear what silence reveals. Still, there is another uncomfortable truth hidden inside Jacob's story. Consequences often arrive through repetition. Think about Jacob carefully. He deceived. Then later, he experienced deception himself. He manipulated family dynamics. Then later, his own family became fractured. Jealousy, competition, favoritism, conflict among children, pain, repeated. And honestly, that feels uncomfortable. Because many people quietly ask, why do painful patterns keep repeating in my life? Maybe because unresolved choices often recreate themselves. Modern psychology calls this repetition, compulsion, the tendency to unconsciously recreate unresolved emotional experiences. People repeat unhealthy relationships, repeat toxic communication, repeat emotional survival patterns learned in childhood, not because they want suffering, but because familiar pain feels strangely normal. And perhaps Jacob unknowingly repeated what shaped him. He grew up inside favoritism. Later, he favored Joseph. He grew up inside sibling rivalry. Later, his sons carried rivalry too. Pain traveled, because unresolved wounds often become inherited patterns. And perhaps that matters deeply today, because many people think consequences only mean punishment, but consequences are often subtler. Sometimes, the consequence of dishonesty is distrust. The consequence of emotional avoidance is loneliness. The consequence of fear is isolation. The consequence of unresolved trauma is repetition. And maybe that is harder to notice, because not all consequences arrive dramatically. Some arrive quietly, inside identity, inside relationships, inside habits. Still, there is another question many people ask. Can people truly change? Because honestly, Jacob raises an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe people do not stay the same forever. Maybe guilt can teach. Maybe suffering transforms. Maybe consequences themselves become teachers. Look at Jacob again. The manipulator became humbled. The runaway stopped running. The deceiver faced truth. The fearful man finally faced Esau. And perhaps that matters, because modern culture swings between extremes. Some people believe people never change. Others believe the past does not matter. But perhaps both ideas miss something important. Maybe change is possible, but costly, slow, painful, messy. Real transformation often requires consequences, humility, loss, honest confrontation. And perhaps that is why Jacob wrestled, not merely with God, but with reality, with himself, with truth. And maybe modern people wrestle too. Burnout forcing honesty, heartbreak forcing reflection, failure exposing weakness, loss revealing priorities. Sometimes, life teaches through consequences what wisdom could have taught earlier, painfully, slowly. Still, there is another, uncomfortable truth. Running often creates more pain than facing things honestly. Imagine Jacob's life? Years of fear, years wondering, what if Esau finds me? Years carrying unresolved guilt. And perhaps that feels familiar too, because many people delay hard conversations, avoid apologies, avoid healing, avoid truth, convincing themselves, maybe time will fix it. Sometimes time helps, but unfinished things often stay emotionally alive. And maybe that is why anxiety grows, because hidden truths create emotional weight. The apology never made, the relationship never repaired, the pain never processed, the grief never faced. And perhaps life quietly asks everyone eventually, how long will you keep running? Because maybe running protects temporarily, but confrontation heals eventually. And perhaps Jacob finally learned that the moment he faced Esau, the moment he stopped hiding, something shifted, not perfectly, not magically, but honestly. Still, before this becomes too heavy, there is something deeply hopeful hidden inside Jacob's story too. Consequences do not always destroy, sometimes they transform. This matters, because many people hear stories about consequences and quietly fear, maybe I already ruined everything. Maybe my choices permanently define me. But perhaps Jacob tells a different story. Consequences matter. Yes, pain matters. Regret matters. But stories continue. People grow. People heal. People learn. Sometimes, the very thing people fear most becomes the doorway to change. Jacob feared Esau, yet reconciliation became possible. Jacob feared truth, yet honesty transformed him. Jacob feared consequences, yet consequences reshaped him. And perhaps that matters for people listening today, because maybe the thing you fear facing most is also the place healing begins. The apology, the boundary, the confession, the grief, the truth, the hard conversation, the responsibility, and maybe that is why Jacob still matters, because he reminds humanity. You may run for years, build distractions, create distance, hide behind success. Yet eventually, life asks one uncomfortable question. Are you ready to face what you have been avoiding? Because perhaps peace never arrives through escape. Maybe peace arrives after honesty, after responsibility, after courage, after finally standing still long enough to stop running. And now, Jacob leaves us with a deeply personal question, one many people quietly fear. What consequence are you still trying to outrun? That life keeps gently bringing back a relationship, a truth, a wound, a habit, a version of yourself. Because maybe the hardest journeys are not about distance. Maybe the hardest journeys happen when people finally stop running and turn around, because sometimes the consequences people fear most become the very thing teaching them who they were always meant to become. And so, after the deception, after the running, after the fear, after the wrestling, we arrive at the end of Jacob's story. Or perhaps not the end, because some stories refuse to stay buried in history. Some stories survive because they speak to something deeply human: fear, shame, identity, family wounds, the desperate longing to become someone different. And perhaps that is why Jacob still matters. Not because he was perfect, not because he was heroic, but because he feels painfully human, complicated, wounded, flawed, trying, failing, changing. Because maybe Jacob's story is not really about a stolen blessing. Perhaps it is about a broken person learning transformation. And maybe that is where the first lesson begins. Lesson 1. People often become what their wounds teach them to be. Think about Jacob's childhood. A divided family, unequal love, competition, favoritism, a father preferring one son, a mother protecting another, growing up inside emotional uncertainty. And perhaps that matters more than people realize, because wounds shape identity. Children adapt quietly, automatically. People learn survival patterns early. Some become people pleasers. Some become perfectionists. Some become avoiders. Some become controllers. Some become manipulators. Not because they are evil, because somewhere they learned something painful. This is how I survive. Perhaps Jacob learned, if I do not secure blessing myself, someone else will take it. That belief shaped him. And honestly, many people carry similar beliefs today. He must prove my worth. He cannot trust people. He have to control outcomes. If I become vulnerable, I will get hurt. People often call these personality traits, but sometimes they are survival strategies wearing different clothes. And perhaps Jacob quietly reminds us, understanding wounds matters, because people rarely heal what they never understand. Still, understanding wounds does not remove responsibility, which leads to something harder. Lesson 2. Pain explains behavior but does not excuse it. This part feels uncomfortable, because modern culture sometimes swings too far. Some people say, the past made me this way. And perhaps there is truth in that. The past shapes people. Childhood matters. Family matters. Trauma matters. Pain matters. But Jacob reminds us of something equally important. Being wounded does not remove responsibility. Jacob had reasons for manipulation. Fear, insecurity, competition. Yet deception still hurt people. Esau suffered. Shishak suffered. family fractured, consequences arrived. And perhaps that balance matters deeply, because healing begins when people stop saying, "This is just who I am," and begin asking, "Why am I this way? And who do I want to become?" That question changes lives, because explanations matter, but responsibility matters too. And perhaps Jacob's transformation only began when he finally stopped running from truth. But there is another lesson hidden inside his story, one many people struggle to accept. Lesson 3: you cannot heal while running from yourself. Jacob spent years running from Esau, running from guilt, running from consequences, building distance, building distraction, building new life. Yet somehow, the past remained unfinished. And honestly, many people understand that feeling. People run through busyness, work, relationships, achievement, distraction, anything avoiding stillness, because stillness feels dangerous. Stillness reveals wounds. Stillness reveals fear. Stillness reveals regret. And, perhaps, that is why Jacob's wrestling moment matters so deeply, because eventually, life forced him to stop. Alone, no performance, no strategy, no control, only truth. And maybe that is where transformation begins for everyone. When pretending stops, when excuses stop, when honesty finally arrives. The terrifying moment people ask, "Who have I become?" And perhaps many people spend years avoiding that question, because honesty hurts. Still, healing often begins there, not in comfort, in truth. But Jacob teaches another painful lesson too. Lesson 4. Real change usually costs something. Modern culture loves instant transformation, quick fixes, motivational slogans, easy healing. But Jacob's story feels messier than that. Change took years. Consequences, fear, loneliness, loss, hard lessons. The wrestling left him wounded. Remember that? Transformation cost him something. He walked differently afterward, literally, limping. And perhaps that feels symbolic, because real change leaves marks. Healing often hurts. Breaking toxic patterns hurts. Facing truth hurts. Apologizing hurts. Setting boundaries hurts. Growth rarely feels comfortable, and perhaps that is why many people stay stuck. Because old pain feels familiar, new growth feels frightening. But Jacob quietly reminds us, remaining the same also costs something. Peace, connection, meaning, freedom. And perhaps the real question becomes, which pain will you choose? The pain of staying trapped, or the pain of becoming different? Still, there is something deeply hopeful in Jacob's story too. Something many people desperately need. Lesson 5. Your worst choices do not have to be your final identity. This matters, because many people secretly believe, he ruined too much. He hurt too many people. This is simply who I am now. But Jacob's story argues something radical. People can change, not perfectly, not instantly, but genuinely. Think about it. Jacob began as a deceiver, a manipulator, a runner. Yet later, history remembers him differently. Not because the past disappeared, but because transformation happened. And perhaps that matters for people carrying guilt today. Because guilt can become wisdom. Failure can become humility. Consequences can become teachers. Pain can become growth. Only if people stop hiding from them. And perhaps that is one of the most hopeful things Jacob still teaches humanity. You are not only who you once were, you are also who you are becoming. But finally, Jacob leaves us with perhaps the deepest lesson of all. Lesson 6. Identity changes when people stop chasing blessing and start becoming honest. Jacob spent much of his life chasing blessing, securing approval, controlling outcomes, protecting identity, trying to feel enough. And honestly, many people still do this, chasing validation, success, recognition, status, love, achievement, trying desperately to silence an inner fear. Am I enough? But perhaps Jacob discovered something deeper. Real peace did not arrive when he stole blessing. Peace began arriving when he stopped pretending, when he admitted truth, when he wrestled honestly, when he finally stopped running. And maybe that matters deeply today, because perhaps many people are exhausted from performing, pretending, proving, controlling, running, trying to become worthy. And perhaps life quietly asks something gentler. What if healing begins when you stop pretending to be someone else? Because remember, Jacob literally disguised himself as Esau, pretending to be someone different to receive blessing. Yet transformation only began when he finally stood honestly as himself, wounded, complicated, afraid, real. And perhaps that is where identity finally changes, not through perfection, through honesty. And now, after thousands of years, Jacob leaves us with one final question, a difficult one, a deeply personal one. What part of yourself are you still running from? That life may be asking you to finally face your guilt, your fear, your past, your pain, the person you became while trying to survive. Because maybe real transformation does not happen when people finally win. Maybe real transformation begins when people stop running long enough to honestly wrestle with who they are. And maybe that is Jacob's final lesson. You do not find peace by escaping your story. You find peace by finally becoming honest inside it.